I'd like to open up the discussion now to the other panelists. I thought I would start with you, Josh, who is, as it were, for our purposes today, the designated spokesperson for, if you like, the Green New Deal as was. You did you'll have to unmute. You did an excellent paper a couple of years back, I think, out of Roosevelt on the Green New Deal conception. How does this latest 2021 evolution of the debate strike you? How does it, as natural development or something rather different?
I think in some ways it's a step backward. Look, I mean, there are basically four ways we can approach decarbonization. We can have a sort of price-based approach with taxes and subsidies, carbon pricing. That was sort of the dominant view not so many years ago. We can have a credit policy-based approach where we favor green assets, disfavor brown assets. That's kind of where this credit rating agency is kind of located. We can have a regulatory approach. We just ban coal plants, or we can have an approach focused on direct public investment. And I think one of the defining features of the Green New Deal is to really put a lot more weight on the direct public investment side, that you actually just need government picking appropriate projects and financing them itself. And I think the reason we saw that shift is because of a general recognition of the limits of market coordination and the profit motive in general, and specifically the limits of market coordination when you're talking about large-scale rapid transformation. Things historically like industrialization, war mobilization have always seen a dominant role for the state in directing investment. Markets simply don't work at that speed and scale. And I also think it's because we want to link to broader issues of social justice. Sally brought up racial justice. We could talk about other issues where market incentives or credit policy are not going to do that. And it also because we have more confidence in the capacity of the federal government than we had a few years ago. If you look at, Janet Yellen the other day saying, we want a more active government in the economy. That's not something you would have heard from a Democratic administration a few years ago. And I think that links up to a notion that we want to politicize this project. We don't want to depoliticize it. We don't want it to be technocratic because we want, first of all, to achieve explicitly political goals about justice and equity in conjunction with decarbonization. And secondly, because it's a strength to involve movements, to involve politics. It's because we think we can win on the politics. And I do think that's a sort of fundamental part of the Green New Deal vision, that we're not looking over our shoulders about what happens. Oh, well, the other side is going to come back in. It's saying we can mobilize people and we can actually win this fight. That's, I think, sort of central. And I do think there's one more piece, which is that the constraints on the government that people believed in a few years ago, particularly around the financing, look a lot less daunting today. There's clearly far less fear of government debt than there used to be, and with good reason, because we've had vast expansions of public borrowing with none of the economic costs that was supposed to imply. And we certainly see, again, in the language that we hear today from the administration, from other leading Democrats, there's simply no hint of what you would have gotten in the Obama or Clinton administrations about the importance of having some sort of long-run plan for deficit reduction. Even though the plans are notionally paid for, that's certainly not something that is being stressed. So I think there's a sense in which the political constraints on borrowing are not necessarily, and I would argue it would be a mistake to say, well, that's just given, that's a constraint we can't get around, and therefore we need to find some way of evading it or working around. We need to hide government borrowing off balance sheet through guarantees because we simply can't politically have the federal government borrow anymore. The lesson of the past decade, if we've learned anything, is that the political constraints on government borrowing are a lot more elastic than we would have thought. So I think it would be kind of foolish at this point to say, oh no, we can't go any further down that road. We've got to go back to, talking about ways of disguising it. Now, let me just say something about the sort of financing piece, because I think there's something very appealing about the National Investment Authority and something problematic about it. And two things have been sort of merged, and I'd like to clarify, because there's sort of two things that it's doing. One is it's getting money from markets. It's issuing some type of new liability. It's competing with other investment vehicles to pool our savings. The other thing it's doing is distributing that money to projects. It is, as it's described, both a lender and a borrower in the markets. And I think those two functions are actually very different because the federal government is already the best borrower there is. The federal, Sally says we need to outcompete the financial markets. The federal government already does that. The federal government issues more desirable, higher priced, more liquid liabilities than anybody else in the economy. The problem of getting money out of the private sector has been solved. It has been solved by the existence of the Treasury bond. There's simply no need for a new institution there. Treasury bonds do not need to be interesting. We don't want them to be interesting. We want them to be exactly the way they are because they are the ideal vehicle for getting money out of the private sector at the lowest cost in a way that actually supports, financial stability. The government's strength is as a borrower. If there is an underutilized financial resource that we need to be talking about getting better use out of, it is not the private sector capacity to lend, it is the public sector capacity to borrow. On the other hand, where we do need the private sector is on the productive side. There's lots of productive expertise, there's lots of labor, there's lots of capital, there's lots of firms that have built up the capacity to do things that we need to do, and we want to support that. So the challenge of an institution like the NIA, it seems to me, is to leverage the federal government's strength as a borrower on behalf of the productive capabilities of the private sector, which means to me the key test for something like an NIA is that it needs to be located financially downstream from the federal government. It needs to be in some form borrowing money from the federal government and then on lending it to private projects. Just two quick points sort of in support of that. First of all, there's no particular virtue to any special group of private lenders. We sometimes hear about patient capital. I think that's a word we should strike from our vocabulary. Pension funds, insurance companies, their liabilities may be long-term, but the people managing those went to the same business schools and took the same finance classes as the people managing every other pot of money. And the pension fund beneficiaries may be there in 30 years, but they're not the ones managing the pension fund. The people managing it will not be there in 30 years. If they don't get a good return tomorrow or a relatively short horizon, they won't have that job anymore. So these funds are looking for returns on the same terms as any other. There's no special affinity between one pot of money and decarbonization investment. And then the other thing, and I think this is sort of a fundamental point here, is how do we feel about the multiplication of veto points in the American political system? Because this is a distinctive feature of the political system, both constitutionally, and then we've added to it with institutions like the CBO. The Green Rating Agency, as it's described, is very much an additional veto point. We can't have the National Investment Authority autonomously deciding what investments it needs. There should be a separate body, like sort of CBO-like body, that's going to vet that. We can't have the federal government simply making guarantees or loans to local governments. We need an additional veto point before that can happen. I think, and I would say a lot of people, I would say on the Green New Deal side of things, would say that the proliferation of veto points in the American political system is a bad thing, that the role of the CBO has been quite negative. It has been an obstacle to the kind of spending that we need to make if we're going to decarbonize, and that we do not want to multiply additional veto points. So an appeal of something like the NIA, as Sally lays it out, is that it centralizes decision-making about green investment. It actually reduces the number of veto points in the system. It reduces the number of overlapping jurisdictions. So to me, Sally says, well, I think this rating agency is perfectly consistent, but to me, actually, the rating agency is being proposed specifically to eliminate one of the strengths of the NIA, which is its ability to sort of have autonomous, centralized decision-making about directing investment. So I think we should, if you want to make the other argument that no, actually it's good we don't trust political decision makers, we don't trust democratic politics because, next year it might be the Republicans. We don't think we can win the political argument, and therefore we need to multiply veto points and then hope we can get our people into the strategic locations. We should make that argument, but I don't think we should take it for granted that proliferating additional overlapping competing agencies is intrinsically a good thing.
Thank you, Josh. That was about as crisp a statement of the implicit sort of democratic sovereigntist logic of the GND as I've ever heard. I really appreciate the force with which you put that point.